You.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny Jo, for being with us today. Jenny Jo Allen, my goodness, all these noises, I apologize, is the Education and Outreach Coordinator at ASPEN, which is the acronym for Abuse Support and Prevention Education Network. She serves communities within the 7,000 square mile radius of Park, Sweetgrass, and Marr counties. Jenny Jo has a BS in Applied Psychology with an emphasis on health and human development from Montana State University in Bozeman. She has over 17 years of work experience in social and mental health services and continues to focus on improving community health through her primary prevention efforts at ASPEN. Jenny Jo believes in creating safe places for all people to express themselves and facilitates, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time breathing today, ASPEN's Queer Straight Alliance support group for LGBTQ plus community members and their allies. Jenny Jo also serves as the co-founder and prevention committee chairperson of the Park County Human Trafficking Task Force. And we're going to go ahead and post Jenny's contact information in the chat should you have any further questions for Jenny. So Jenny, welcome. We're so glad to have you. And I'm going to let you take off because you do this on a regular basis and you're perfectly comfortable moving forward.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, I want to first just give a land acknowledgement. As an organization, ASPEN wants to answer the call from many to open with an acknowledgement of traditional native inhabitants of the land and honor those who came before us in the fight for justice. Before we formally begin today, we would like to respectfully acknowledge the Native people who have stewarded this land and remember those who came before us. And since people are joining from all around Montana, the tribes may be different or in addition to the tribes on the land that I'm speaking from. On the land that I'm speaking from, we have the tribes of Crow, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet. So, quote from Martin Luther King Jr., "We are not satisfied and will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." All right, so today I'm going to talk about human trafficking and specifically a tool for trafficking victim identification. Many of us on this call are working directly with survivors of human trafficking, and sometimes we may not even realize it. So I just want to get a couple of housekeeping things out of the way before we start digging into the good stuff. One is that if you have questions come up during this presentation, please just put them in the chat box and I will allow time for, I got my phone right here keeping track of the time, so I will try to give at least 15 minutes for questions at the end. If some of you need to leave early and you have questions come up that you're not going to be able to stay to get answered, feel free to email me anytime with any questions, and I will give the slide deck to Jamie so that she can send it to anybody who wants, and we are recording this as well. So if you have to leave early, I totally understand. We all have busy schedules. So I'm going to go ahead and start. So I work with ASPEN. As Jamie said, it's an acronym for Abuse Support and Prevention Education Network. And the way that I like to describe it to people is a very visual way. And it's that if you see the tree here, that is actually our acronym: Trust, Respect, Empowerment, Empathy. That's actually our program that we use for education, is the tree education program. But if you think of, if you see that, and if you see aspens, picture an aspen grove in your mind, you know that they spread their roots. That's how they become aspen groves. And so if you can imagine, those roots are the healthy relationships that we are creating in our community with our collaboration and with our support of each other and lifting each other up. Those are how we see that advocacy and that prevention work. And then if you think of the branches, there's a branch that's for abuse support, and that is our safe house, our 24/7, 365 days out of the year, anytime. We have trained advocates answering our support line, which is 406-222-8154. And we also have crisis intervention. Our advocates can help a person if they're having to have a SANE kit done, or going to court, or needing some legal advocacy, an order of protection, or maybe some help with some parenting plans and things like that. So that's our abuse support branch. So imagine, if you can, the big branch of that aspen tree as abuse support, and then on the other side there's a huge branch of prevention education, and that's what I do. So I work with everybody in our communities, which are the Sweetgrass Park and Marr counties, that go to schools, law enforcement, things like this with the Department of Corrections, and try to just teach primary prevention, which is how can we prevent violence from happening in the first place? And there's teaching, especially with young kids, teaching empathy and kindness and bullying prevention, and then on up through the high schools with dating, abuse, and sexual assault prevention, and then human trafficking, also teaching young ones what it actually looks like, so that they can avoid the red flags of those types of relationships. And if you want to know more about us, or follow our social media links, you can go to our webpage, which I have on our resource page later in the slides, but it's aspenmt.org. And that's a really great, we actually have an amazing website, and we're pretty good at keeping it up to date. So if you want to know what events we're having, or if you need some resources, please check that out. So how did the Park County Human Trafficking Task Force begin? Well, Aspen had Penny Ronning, who's the co-founder of the Yellowstone County Human Trafficking Task Force, present at a lunch and learn, pre-COVID days, when we got to be together in the Livingston Food Resource Center. I miss those days. That was our lunch and learns, we typically, the in-person lunch and learns, we were getting 30 to 40 people. So it was a real way of connecting with our community. And in this particular lunch and learn, Penny Ronning is such an amazing leader, and she was able to inspire several members of that, or participants of that lunch and learn, to begin a human trafficking task force. So Janella Johnson, who's the chair, and I do have her email in the presentation so that you can email her if you're interested in more about the task force. Janella Johnson and I facilitated a meeting 2 weeks after the lunch and learn, and boom, it just started. Of course, not without hiccups, and luckily we have had so much support from other task forces around Montana. And the Gallatin County Human Trafficking Task Force has been, Tara Bradford with that task force has been instrumental in helping us reduce the hiccups, and also just get on track with our structure. And right now we're working on a collaboration to become an actual coalition with them, because we do serve a lot of the same clients. Our boundaries kind of cross in a lot of different ways. So why not pool resources and support each other through this effort? So at the Yellowstone County Human Trafficking Task Force has been Melanie Tripp and Scott Koch and Susie DeBar. Everybody has been so incredibly supportive and wonderful. And so we have 3 subcommittees in the task force, And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. But we're always trying to stay connected with other task forces around the state. And so if you are on a task force or on a subcommittee of a task force and you want to know what we're doing, we'd be happy to include you in our mailing list so that everybody can keep up to speed on our anti-trafficking efforts. So this is actually a slide that Penny Ronning gave me that is it's in a lot of trainings like the Polaris trainings, and I do want to just mention quickly too that I am using resources from the Polaris Project, from the Lifeguard Group, from the 2019 federal human trafficking report, and from the Vera Institute of Justice. And I do have all those resources at the end of the slideshow listed. So trafficking victims may be forced to work where they live, especially in sex trafficking or domestic servitude. Victims of domestic violence may answer affirmatively to some of the questions that you're asking them that are questions you might be screening to see if trafficking has occurred, but they may not necessarily have been trafficked or there may not necessarily being trafficked, because oftentimes the victim of trafficking doesn't realize they're a victim, or they don't identify as a victim. Traffickers are often, perceived by the victims as romantic partners. There's a huge amount of coercion involved. And so when we're talking about the purpose of commercial sex or labor or services, the problem that we have when we're identifying victims is when they're self-reporting and they're saying they believe that the payment or the services that they obtained, whatever the thing is of value that they obtained for their either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, they believe that those things of value were given to them as well, because they're in this romance. It's like, this is mine too. Yeah, I got paid, even though they may be controlled and that money might be withheld from them. Or that thing of value might be withheld from them. They see when they're in this romantic partnership, they see it as their resources, their things of value. So instead of seeing it as like, oh, this person is gaining from my labor or my sex, they see it as like, this is helping us with our life and our future. And so they may come to you initially, or you may have interactions with them like in detention centers where they call them their boo, their bae, their man, their boyfriend, whatever, and talked about them as like, this is our life that we're building together. And when I get out, we're gonna have this wonderful life, and we're doing all of these things to better our lives for our family. And so kind of understanding that shift in perspective, if you can think about that, it kind of helps to understand why some people don't self-identify as victims. And yet they could identify as domestic violence victims because they're like, he's hitting me, or he's emotionally abusing me and controlling me. It's domestic violence. So they might reach out for help in that area. And if you're an advocate at a domestic violence agency, it's important to understand that you don't want to argue with them, of course, and just meet them where they're at and provide the services that you can to help keep them safe where they're at. But we do want to try to identify trafficking survivors. And why is that? We're going to talk about why it's so important. Another thing just really important to note is that under the legal definition, anyone performing sexual activities for things of value while under 18 years of age is a victim of trafficking, regardless of whether they report having been forced into the situation. So if they're under 18, this is going on, it is human trafficking. And the landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act, you all, and this, I just want to say too, you all on this training, you guys might have more information than I do. So if you want to share some information with me, please feel free to email me that. I would love any information. I know that you all are experts in fields that are different from mine. So I would love to get any kind of feedback in that area too. So you're probably familiar, most people on this call are probably familiar with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it first made trafficking persons a federal crime in 2000. But the reliable screening tools and procedures weren't created at that time. So we had this act without any way to really screen potential victims. So that's an important thing to remember. Like, there's probably a big gap of reporting just because of that, just because of the lack of screening. And then I told you in the previous slide, when I was talking about the Park County Human Trafficking Task Force, that I would get more into the 3 subcommittees. Well, here they are: prevention, prosecution, and protection. So the prevention committee works on things like this that I'm doing and teaching the community human trafficking awareness, what it really looks like, fighting those myths that are out there about trafficking. And then prosecution helps change the systems that be and to help prosecute the buyers and the traffickers, not the victims. Unfortunately, that is something that happens quite frequently, where a victim will be re-traumatized by just interactions with law enforcement. And because of that, even though every state has enacted anti-trafficking legislation, only a small fraction of trafficking victims have been identified, because they're commonly hidden and live far in fear. There's that idea that they're handcuffed in the basement. That's wrong. That's not true. But they are controlled usually by this idea that oftentimes it's fear related, or it's coercion. Oftentimes they know exactly what that person cares about the most. Maybe it's their children, or maybe it's their parents, or maybe it's their pet, and they threaten to hurt those people. It's not always threats and physical violence toward the person. It can be threats of physical violence against someone else. And so that idea that these victims are being treated as criminals and being charged with prostitution instead of being identified as victims and getting the much needed support and services is it's a disservice to law enforcement, because they don't have the proper tools for identifying victims. So that if they had that tool, if they were using tools and they were able to identify these people as victims instead of criminals, then the increase of resources for them to be able to investigate and have witnesses against traffickers and buyers would increase. So there's a huge benefit to the prosecution part of this Protection Act, and changing the prosecution, changing the paradigm. And in the 2019 Federal Human Trafficking Report, it just straight out says the best way to reduce trafficking is by prosecuting buyers and traffickers, and not just a slap on the wrist, right? So if we have stronger prosecution, that is going to decrease the demand, and that decrease of demand is what is so important with the prevention as well. So all of these really go hand in hand, but it's important to be focusing on them as these separate functions, since there are experts in each field and there's so much that goes into each of these efforts. And then I think somebody might need to mute their mic. I'm just hearing some stuff, hearing some typing and stuff. And then the protection committee, that committee is made up of people in human services like advocates and nurses, therapists, things like that. And they work on making sure that they are serving the victims in the best way possible and meeting their needs. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about when we get into the tool, is how important it is that the victims' needs are met prior to digging into these really tough questions. So if somebody is a victim of trafficking and they are homeless or houseless and they have children and they're new in the area and they haven't gotten them enrolled in school and they don't have food, those things are going to be on the top of that person's mind. They need to get their family shelter, food, and enrolled in school. And so those are the things that the protection committee would be working on to smooth line so that they can then work on the bigger picture of prosecuting the trafficker or the buyer and/or. Okay. The different agencies who work in anti-trafficking at the federal level are assigned to states depending on the numbers reported. So that brings us to, why is it so important to differentiate between domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking? It's because the funding from those resources, so the funding to give the FBI agents, give Montana more FBI agents, give Montana more funds to help the victims, those kinds of things. Those are driven by our numbers of how many trafficking victims we have. So if we're not reporting it, we're not getting the funding. If we're not getting the funding, we're going to have a harder time fighting it and changing the systems that need to be changed. We need to have reporting that is consistent and in line with federal guidelines across the state, which is one of the reasons, it's the main reason that we started the Park County Human Trafficking Task Force. And it's the main reason why these task force members, why we all work so closely together. We want consistency and we want accurate reporting to the federal level so that we can get the funding we need to help these victims and to end modern day slavery. And so here's a look, and this is from the 2019 report by the federal government. Here's a look. Okay, the white means that under no sex trafficking cases or under 10. The white is 1 to 10, the gray, the no color is no cases reported. This does not mean that there weren't any trafficking. This means that we're not reporting. So if you see the whites, that Montana were white in both human trafficking and labor trafficking and sex trafficking cases, or both of those, were white. That means under 10 cases, and we know that's not true. We know that's not true because we've had more survivors go through systems and go to other states even and say, yeah, I came from Montana. I was trafficked in Montana. And so it's important for us to get the reports right and have those reports accurately related in these federal the federal guidelines for reporting, because if we don't get the funds. And look at that corridor, check it out. How easy, I know that, okay, so there is a myth that trafficking, you have to cross borders. That's not true. Many people are trafficked out of their own home, like I talked about before. But It's the numbers are really unreliable and they vary wildly, and so it's a huge barrier to getting this funding. And so, for example, figures that are often cited suggest that anywhere from 14,500 to 50,000 people are trafficked in the U.S. annually. And more recent estimates place the number of currently enslaved people in the U.S. at 57 to 63,000. And yet, I mean, that's a huge difference. 14,500 to 63,000, huge difference. And that's also going to equate to huge difference in services because of funding. The U.S. Department of State estimated in 2010 that less than 1% of current trafficking victims in the U.S. have been identified. Less than 1%. So the reason why the Vera Institute did this study and created this identification tool is it comes from that U.S. Department of State estimate in 2010 that less than 1% of current trafficking victims have been identified. That drove them to create an effective victim identification practice. They were already working on it. They started in 2006. That they were able to get funding. Okay, I'm going to go back more into the tool in just a second, but I do want to give them a moment to really promote the Montana Hotline for human trafficking. So many of us know the Polaris Hotline and the National Hotline, but the problem with using a national hotline when we're working with victims, excuse me, victims and survivors. Oh, I'm gonna have to get a drink. Hold on one sec. Sorry. You and me both, Jamie. What's going on? Okay. So the problem with using a national hotline for Montana victims and survivors is that they oftentimes don't get the help they needed in a timely manner, and so they slip through the cracks. And so the lifeguard group, and actually Stephanie Bacchus and Penny Ronning with the Yellowstone County Human Trafficking Task Force, they actually helped the lifeguard group get the funding for this hotline for Montana, and then the lifeguard group is maintaining it. So they train the volunteers for the hotline, and they're just an amazing group. I'm sure you all are aware of the lifeguard group, but this number is fairly new. They just got this hotline a few months ago and went live with it. And so the Park County Task Force, we asked them, hey, is it okay if we promote this? And they're like, of course, please do. We need everyone in Montana to be using this number. There was an example, I'm trying to remember which presentation. I think it was during an interview that some task force members and the lifeguard group had with the attorney general candidates back before the election. And Lowell talked about one particular survivor of trafficking who had called the national hotline from Montana, and they didn't get help until 2 weeks later. They weren't connected to local services. So please use this instead of the Polaris hotline. If you're dealing with somebody who is in Montana, they can connect them to services in Montana a lot quicker. And sometimes that's a difference between life and death. Okay, so we're going to dig into the trafficking victim identification tool. Let me check the time. Oh, we're doing good. Got 15 minutes. Okay. Good. All right. So this is from the Vera Institute of Justice. I had actually never heard of them before I learned of this tool. I took a webinar, I don't know, about a year ago when COVID happened and we could all start doing webinars all day long. Remember that? Because we were all like, what do I do now? I can't do my job. What am I going to do? I have to sit here at a computer. And then I started following them, and they do a lot of really great work for justice. So this tool came from them, and I'll just give you a little background. This link will go to the tool. So if I click it, I don't want to screw up our presentation, so I'm hoping it will show it. If not, I'll just escape. But oh yay. Can everybody see it? No? Okay, never mind. Oh no. Oh dear. I was afraid of that. Hello. Sorry about that, folks.
We still see your PowerPoint screen.
Oh, you
Jenny
can?
Jo.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So can you see it?
Jenny, I can see it. It says the tool is a statistically validated. Is that the, then it's a,
If I move it like this, can you see that now?
yes, trust.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So that didn't work, but I do have this link also it'll be in the slide deck, of course, because it's here, but I also have it in the resources at the end. Advocates, if there are any advocates out there, or if there are any, I know like Courtney being in the detention center there and the prison, women's prison, you have direct contact with people who may not identify as being trafficked, but may be trafficked. And so these questions would be, and especially in that setting where they're not going anywhere, you have time to be able to ask these questions from time to time, or in conversations after building rapport possibly. But the tool validation, I just want to go into it really quickly before we start going into the actual how to use the tool. The tool validation is really important, of course. And one of the things that they state in when they're talking about in the full technical report, they did state that they had the people who were U.S. born native residents who were questioned, they were all youth, and the all of the adults that were questioned, many of them were born in other places and then moved to U.S., or many of them were U.S. born but to foreign immigrants families. So they did say that there should be another study with this tool. It was statistically accurate and validated, but they said, you know, to have it more widely studied would be good too. Like it's never a bad thing, and we do recognize the limitations of our participants. So just know that going into it, but it did, it was also statistically analyzed and it was tested by service providers. So people like you and me, people who are advocates, people who are working in probation and things like that. So those service providers also tested it, and it was shown to be statistically valid as well. So it also demonstrated, when they did the analysis, it demonstrated which questions were best for predicting trafficking outcomes. And its full form is 16 questions, but you can use it in the full form or the shortened form. And the two versions can be used in succession at separate times. For example, service providers who are mandatory reporters or working in a crisis situation may wish to use the short version of the tool for initial screening, and you can also use it with your intake. So with the shortened version, you might choose to use just a few questions from the short version in your intake because the rapport hasn't been built, and that brings me to the trust. The trust is the most important thing, and the studies, the analysis they did on these questions, that was made it abundantly clear that the questions were answered accurately and honestly more in line with the people who had trust with the person who was interviewing them. So it's not like you're going to be like, hi, welcome, here's an intake, and I'm going to ask you all of these really intense questions that are very personal. So the number one most important thing is to make sure that they feel safe. If they don't, even if they are safe, but they don't feel safe, then skip the questioning. Don't do the interview until they feel safe. And as we know, working with victims and survivors, oftentimes their traumatic response is to is putting them in a place where they feel they're in danger, even if they might not be in immediate danger. And so just being understanding and meeting them where they're at and letting them take whatever time and whatever steps they need to be able to feel safe and stable and ready to talk about sensitive issues. And, you know, sometimes people will say, well, they're answering these and they're not telling the truth. They're being inconsistent with what I know to be true of them. And that's another trauma response, you know, especially if they're not feeling safe to be honest with the interviewer. They are probably going to throw up some walls, which is completely understandable, right? And so just knowing to build trust, and if you need more information on tools for building trust, motivational interviewing is a wonderful skill that you can practice, or Brene Brown has an anatomy of trust lesson that you can get online, so that you can find other ways to build trust with your clients, so that you can be one step closer to asking these important questions that could lead to reporting, that could lead to federal funding, that could lead to ending trafficking. So step one is that trust. And then there are a lot of guidelines on how to use this screening tool and when it can be used, but they're very flexible. So just like saying you can use it with your intake questions, or you can use the long version or the short version, all of those are you know, flexibilities that in some screening tools you don't have. So after you have rapport with your potential victim, then you can ask questions and really roll with their resistance, like they say in motivational interviewing. If they start to have resistance to a question, stop, and then maybe at a different time, when there's trust and safety, felt safety there, then maybe go into where you left off with some questions. And you just really have to be mindful that even though you want to get those answers as soon as possible, it might just push that person away from you. And you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm really interested to hear some feedback from the Department of Corrections and people who are working in the Department of Corrections on when you do have somebody who is institutionalized or imprisoned, how that could be used as a tool, because you do have more time with that person. Maybe not. That's not my level of my area of expertise, but I'm interested.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm having a weird thing happening on my computer. It is kind of, and I had a question from Stephanie too, who said, how do you not identify at HT that results in federal prosecution? But here's some of the stuff we experience, especially in the Billings area, where we've had a significant uptick in human trafficking victims.
Uh-huh.
And they don't know they're being human trafficked. It can start at the detention center before they're transitioned to the prison. Somebody starts anonymously putting money onto their account.
Yes.
And then they kind of start roping them in. And some so then they get to,
there's that pipeline, that prison to trafficking pipeline that happens.
and so we know that happens, and we're trying to educate internally about that. We sent out a human trafficking video that was by a former inmate about how she didn't even self-identify because, she received drugs in exchange for sex trafficking. And so she thought she was getting paid. And so it is asking the right questions. And I hope we can read some questions. I think you probably will. See, like you got up here. We're asking the right questions. Like when Maria sat down with a few of these gals and who had not identified themselves.
Right.
And a few, and one in particular that's in the middle of, they went to the grand jury in Billings last week because after having asked the questions and worked with her in building a rapport, she was willing to testify against a ring that runs from Billings to Las Vegas to Texas.
Nice.
And back up, but they're dressed beautifully. All of their needs are met. They're having the time of their life. They're flying around and seeing things, right? Rather than being poor on the streets of Billings. So
right. Yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the biggest reasons why that primary prevention is so important, of ending vulnerabilities, because if your life is better being trafficked than it is at home, then we have a systemic problem, and we need to deal with those vulnerabilities, which are things like youth homelessness, especially for the LGBTQ community who get kicked out of their homes and they're using survival sex. So if somebody who is not identifying as being trafficked, who is willing to testify like you're talking about, going from somebody who wasn't willing to even identify as being trafficked to then testifying against their trafficker. Wow. I mean, that's what you're doing it right. That's the way to do it. You build rapport, you take the time, step by step, slowly. It takes time to build trust. And so it sounds like that example that you gave is the way to do it. Like, you guys are doing it right. That is the right way to do it. Is it being done that way across our state? I'm not sure. I don't know. I only know the areas that we're in. I did a training for the sheriff's department in Sweetgrass County a couple years ago when I first started at ASPEN, and I asked everybody, hey, deputies, raise your hand if you've ever had worked with a trafficking victim, and nobody raised their hand. And I said, okay, deputies, raise your hand if you've ever arrested somebody for prostitution, and almost all of them raised their hand. And so we as a society see this as, and then there's that whole conversation about sex workers and sex workers' rights. But the reality is, when we think about what is choice, do they truly have a choice? Are they truly choosing this life? Or is this all they know? Or do they have, were they raised that this is the norm? Were they in a community with such poverty that they saw this as their only escape and their only way of having any power or control with their situation? So there are questions and things that you can do to get to like you're saying, you built that rapport, or Maria built that rapport and worked with that client until they felt like they were safe opening up to them. And that also realizing what was actually really happening. And sometimes that won't happen. I mean, probably more often than not, you won't have somebody who is able to develop that trust like that. So it is something to work on. And these questions that are here, these were the ones that had the strong predictors that I talked about before. With the statistical analysis, it demonstrated that these were the questions that best predicted trafficking. And if you look at the questions, you're like, well, yeah, because that seems really clear. One thing that many of the questions ask, when it says, have you ever worked? Or one of the things that they do is they'll say, or done activities, or have done activities, because some people don't see sex as work, or they don't see what they did as work. And so, like on that question there, have you ever worked without getting the payment? Have you ever worked or done any activities without getting the payment you thought you would get? So some of their questions, when you look at the tool, you'll see that it'll add that activities question part of the question too, and that's because of that self-identifying piece, and they don't see it as work, or they don't see it as they see it as something that they're doing for their partner or with their partner. And so, or like what you're talking about, they think, oh, I'm get to fly to all of these places and dress in fancy clothes. But that is usually not, that glamour is usually not long lived. And especially if there are drugs involved, if they're controlling them with drugs and drug addiction, it's usually that glamour part is pretty short-lived. Then they are told, okay, you got to pay me back now. I've been forking out all this money for those fancy dresses and plane tickets. Now you owe me. So these are some of the questions, and then here are some of the other strong predictor questions. That the labor trafficking, we know the least about labor trafficking, even though it is known to occur in our area. We don't have as much information on it as we do sex trafficking. And part of that is that, felt like you could not leave the place where you worked or lived. I know in Washington, there have been some documentaries made that show that the migrant farm workers have been held at gunpoint, even not let, that's it, I quit, I can't do this anymore. Nope, you don't quit, you get back to work, and a gun right in their face. So that idea that have you ever felt where you could not leave the place where you worked or lived, that is that control, and that it doesn't always happen with a gun, but it can be that severe. So here are the resources for where I got my information, and also I have Janella Johnson's email on there if you are interested in more information about the Park County Human Trafficking Task Force, and my contact information is there. The Polaris Project, that's a great website. It also has trainings on it that you can do online at your own pace. So I think that's a neat thing. I've done a couple of them, and that's actually where that AMP model is housed. So, did I answer your question okay, Jamie, when you were asking about what do you do when they don't self-identify?
I think you do an amazing job with it. And I do think having the questions is helpful because it gives you more information. And, 10 years ago, we didn't even think to ask those questions.
No, no. And so if you go to that vera.org and go, you can just type in their little search bar, or you can, in the slide deck that I'm going to have Jamie send out to everybody, you can just click on the link. But you can type in this in the search bar too if you don't want to wait. You can just go to the vera.org, type in the search bar, trafficking identification tool, and it will lead you to a page that has a bunch of different, this is what I was going to show you when I clicked on that link and it didn't work, but it has several options. You can download them in Spanish. You can download the technical report that breaks down the research that they did for this tool to show that it's statistically accurate or valid. But yeah, I know that a lot of places say like, hey, we need something to help us identify trafficking victims, and especially when they're intersectioned with domestic violence and sexual violence. Like we really don't have a tool that can suss it out. So this tool is there for everybody. And you know, it's like I said, when in the packet where it has the guidelines for how to use it, it's very flexible. So I think it can be used in a variety of ways. And as they say in their guidelines, the most important thing is to have that rapport and that trust. So if you can only ask one question each meeting with that person, or if maybe it takes you 4 meetings with that person before you can even ask one question, or if that person is opening up to you right away, maybe you go through the whole 16 questionnaire, or you do the short version. So it's flexible in that you can do that, and you can change it depending on the survivor's needs.
So Jenny Jo, for our law enforcement personnel who often don't have time to build rapport with when they're responding, is there a shorter version just for law enforcement so they can get an idea, so we reduce the amount of arrests on prostitution?
Well, there is a short version, and let me look and see. It has, I still think that reports, and they may not open up to law enforcement right away because of that fear, and that power dynamic. But if there is a domestic or sexual violence service agency in your area, maybe you can help link them, you know, do a warm handoff. Law enforcement could always do a warm handoff with the agency's advocate, and then that advocate can build the rapport, and then hopefully at some point, just like with your example with Maria, some point they'll be willing to testify and they'll be willing to press charges. One of the things that is a trend that the 2019 report showed, federal human trafficking report shows a trend in civil cases against their traffickers versus criminal, because sometimes, just like you're saying, like, you know, they're at the law, they're in front of that law enforcement officer, and it's hard to build rapport. They're not reporting it to them, and so it's hard to build a criminal case. But they are working with an advocacy agency, and they build rapport, and so they are able to you know, reach that level of trust where they're disclosing things. And then even though they aren't able to do maybe a criminal charge, they can go through civil court, and so there's a huge increase in civil cases with the victims getting restitution from their traffickers.
That's good news.
Yeah,
right
that's
there.
really, so there are demographic questions. So that's the other thing, is that if your demographic questions that you do in your regular intake match the demographic questions of the short version, they wouldn't have to ask those questions. They could just use their intake for that part. But then let's see, their working living conditions has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And they do have specific questions for law enforcement too. Yeah, so the short version, it is shorter, but it's still kind of long, in my opinion. Like, I think that if you were law enforcement, you could go through this and find the questions that are specific to law enforcement. So, like, there's a question, did anyone ever take a photo of you that you were uncomfortable with? And if they say yes, you say, if you feel comfortable talking about this, could you tell me who took the photo? And then with law enforcement would want to ask, what did they plan to do with the photo, if you know? So if the respondent indicates that the photo was posted online, you should ask which website. So it has directions on how to probe and what to probe for if the person is responding in a way that probing is not going to deter them from having a relationship at all. Like, and you know what I mean. If they say, oh, this is too much, and they just leave, there's nothing you can do. So you want to be really careful and just respect their boundaries. And that's where that motivational interviewing comes in, to really be able to, those skills, those motivational interviewing skills are really handy in situations like this. And I'd love to learn more about the barriers that law enforcement has, because I think there's a way that we can work together and collaborate to overcome those barriers, but we just aren't at that level of communication with law enforcement yet. You know what I mean?
Oh boy, yeah. We're trying. We're all trying together. We just haven't made it comfortable, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, I know here in Livingston, we're pretty close with our law enforcement because we're right across the street. And they're very open to us just popping over and asking questions or doing that kind of stuff, but there's still room for improvement. You know,
Oh,
there's such a limit of resources, and time is the biggest resource, is the limit of that. Just having to really respect each other's time and try to still move forward with this work.
yeah. Well, you're obviously doing a good job with that. Stephanie again says thank you. Jen Buckley says thank you. Teddy Halley says thank you for sharing. This is important information to be shared. This problem is bigger than most people realize, and Teddy's right. Keep the information communication going.
Nice. Awesome.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? No more
Courtney
questions?
says thank you very much. Anybody have any questions for Jenny Jo? I thank you very much too.
Okay, yes.
It's a good discussion to be having. If you're unable to unmute yourself, you are welcome to use the meeting chat, and that is accessed through the bubble on the top right portion of your screen. Victoria says, thank you. Great presentation and discussion.
Thank you. Awesome. Thanks.
We definitely appreciate. Boy, have we been. Come on, Teddy. Hot.
I know, I just have to just say something. How was it to gather or to build the communication from your agency to your law enforcement across the street? I know that they're, there, but did you take, any, steps that you can share with us or?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I personally have a pretty good relationship with the chief and the assistant chief, because they're my neighbors. They live a block away. But and I, it's a small town, so them through this way and through that way in so many different ways. But on a so that's a personal way. But in a professional way, We have invited them over for coffee and had, like breakfast and coffee before their day starts, which, as you know, it's always starting, it's always happening. And then just really being understanding when they have to leave to respond to a call and saying no problem, and just kind of letting it go. And just tons of follow-up and tons of working with whatever they can. I brought in Montana Law Enforcement Academy when I first started because I wanted to see what they knew about human trafficking, what they were being told about human trafficking. And the training was a very broad overview of what human trafficking is. It didn't really have a lot of specifics to it. It was more just an overview. And so that helped me see that they have a lot of information that that's being missed. And so trying to appease them. Not to say I don't struggle with getting in to do trainings. I do. The offering of post credits, so you can use that as a carrot. You can offer post credits, and the only thing about right now with COVID and post credits, and that's one of the reasons why I haven't been able to do any this year, is that you have to, if you're not doing it in person, you have to have some way of tracking that they did actually do the training online. And they have to send in their paperwork separately, each person who does it. So I'm really looking forward to when I can do an in-person training again, which should be very soon, hopefully. And because that should make it a lot easier. And I think a lot of the things too, one of the barriers is that we don't understand, when we're not in law enforcement, we don't understand what their experiences are and what their concerns are. And so, like, when we do meet, having those conversations and really listening to them tell us why they do something the way that they do it, when we didn't understand that, we're like, why, that's just so wrong. Why do you do it that way? And they're like, well, we actually do it because of our safety. We have to maintain our safety, or something like that. So
my household is unique, where I'm a probation and parole officer, but my daughter just recently became a Raleigh County detention, works in the detention center. And so I just her and I both have been to a trafficking meeting up in Missoula, but I didn't think about these questions when people are in the jail. So I just thought it was unique. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Absolutely.
Peggy, I will send you that video. Did you watch that?
I haven't watched the video, no.
Okay.
Is it the one that shows the inmates and they're getting money put into and they're like, who is it? Who and they say the name, and then he's like, what, don't you know him? Don't you know that person? And then she's like, oh yeah, I know him. Because
I don't remember.
Yeah, there's that one scene where I'm just like, oh wow, that was an opportunity. Like, that was an opportunity there for that person to establish some rapport and get somewhere, maybe even just plant a little seed with that person. Like, if you don't know the person who's sending you money, they usually want something from you. They're going to have you pay back some way.
And Maria identified a boyfriend that happened to have like 6 different girlfriends in one of the facilities.
Yep.
And he wanted to take them out of state to a place in Wyoming. And so they're looking at interstate compact. And Maria's like, wait a minute here. This is not adding up, No.
Yeah.
Let's figure this out. So I am really impressed with her skills. She did an amazing job, and it kind of grew. And so now she's receiving a lot of referrals from other people who believe that somebody is vulnerable to it well. So
Yeah.
we love what you do. You have a lot of wonderful, like Carol McCracken said, thank you so much. Maria says, thank you for helping get the word out. Human trafficking is much more prevalent than most people in Montana think. So glad some professionals from Montana Women's Prison could be here today, too. Colleen Singer said, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Jenny Jo.
Oh, thanks,
And
Colleen.
perfect. And Maria's sending the recording to Passages, so other of your presentations, so other people are able to watch it. Annie says, thank you for your time and wealth of resource information. And you're right, Jennifer, Alpha needs to be aware as well, because we know that younger males within the corrections and detention system are also vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I know we focus on females because the vast majority of the ones who report are female.
Mhm, mhm.
Um,
Well, and also if we think of with the males, since they're most likely to be a trafficker or a buyer, you know,
Right.
how do we reduce that demand without prevention wise versus after the fact and they're already in that cycle? Raising boys to be men who are able to express themselves in their vulnerabilities and not have that toxic masculinity where they have to, they don't take no for an answer, and that strength over feelings or anything like that. You know, that's really important. And it's really important too that we have that equality be a message and then be a value that is taught to these boys and men, that it's not about, you know, they're not an object that you can sell over and over and over and over again. They're not an object. This is a human being.
That's right. So Rachel says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I would love to be put on your mailing list for future update. And she lists her email address. Sierra Stout says she's looking forward to looking at some of those trainings and resources. And thanks you. And Victoria has a question. Have you encountered instances of elders being trafficked?
Oh, I haven't, but that's interesting. You have. Oh, nice. I mean, not nice. Sorry.
Right. I know.
I mean,
we
I
understand.
like getting the information. Like, I want to know. What was that experience like? That's a really great question.
Experience was an elderly lady. It wasn't mine. It was one of my staff whose partner took her across the country in a RV, but they couldn't afford to do a lot of things. So his way of handling that was she would have to do sexual acts with other people in order for them to have money. But she'd never been out of Montana. And they made it all the way to Florida and back doing that.
Oh.
And so, and yeah, and so she had not self-identified as a human trafficking victim. It was awkward, but her experiences she felt were rich, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
She got to travel states she'd never seen before, and he was essentially taking care of her and trafficking her.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you're right, it doesn't have to leave the state, but there's a prime one where it goes. I mean, where it goes outside.
That I-90 corridor.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, thanks, Victoria. I just thought to myself as I look back at all the years that I worked with victims, how many human trafficking victims I have missed because I did not know the right questions to ask.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I worked in adult basic education early in my career. And I think back on some of the families that came through there, especially one family just really bothers me because I'm pretty sure that they were probably trafficking their children as well. So I didn't know it then. You don't know what you don't know. And I didn't know it then. No, none of my coworkers knew it then. we didn't know the warning signs.
I agree. But because of people like you, awareness is being raised. So thank you very much, Jenny Jo.
Thank you,
Oh,
Jean. Yes.
and Carol asked, do you reach out to the schools?
I do. So what I do for ASPEN in my education role is I do go into the schools and I teach social emotional learning skills, and I also teach bullying prevention and abuse prevention. And human trafficking does come up. I do bring it up in when I talk about consent and coercion with the high schoolers. And of course, you know, when I'm teaching kindergartners, I don't teach them that, but we do talk about not going with strangers and all of the safety things. I use the talking about touching curriculum. And Tara Bradford with the Gallatin County Human Trafficking Task Force does have a curriculum that she uses to teach in schools, and she's so generous with her knowledge and her services that she's going to go with me into the schools starting in the fall. So
Wonderful.
we're going to be teaching specifically on human trafficking, and it will be with the older kids. Again, it'll be with the high schoolers. I don't know of any curriculum that's out there for elementary, but like I said, just teaching the basic safety rules, that's where they are developmentally anyway. They're learning those anyway. And then as we get into junior high, I start teaching about boundaries and consent and empathy. And yeah, and so, yeah, it's, if there ever is a curriculum out there that you find for elementary students on trafficking prevention, send it to me, please. I don't know how, I mean, that would be a hard thing to talk about with littles, you know.
It would with the littles.
Yeah, that would be really confusing. They get confused even when I'm talking about, you know, not to play with matches. You know, they still get confused.
Yes. And they make up their own stories in their mind.
They sure do. They sure do. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you all. You are all amazing, and I appreciate everything that you do. I love hearing that we have more rich resources that I did not know existed. So I am thrilled that you spoke up during a training, and I'm like, hey, wait a minute. Can we have you?
I know, that was great.
So
I love it. The one advantage to COVID are these connections.
it really is. And I'm able to see people I never would have seen at a normal training too.
Right.
I love it. Well, thank you for doing an educational hour with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much.
So do we. So I am going to let everybody go because we have people who are very conscientious and won't leave unless we say,
Okay.